That means we're live.
Hey, that means that we are live. Yep.
Fantastic.
Guys,
Guys, everything set up, readily prepared. We're live. We have people already with us, I think, connecting, right?
Yeah, we're just going to give it maybe 3 more minutes, as usually these days.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Remote meetings are usually right up to the hour. Then
let's give people a bit of time.
On to the next one.
Exactly. If they're like us, they probably have a 5-minute overlap from meeting to meeting that they try to work around.
That gives me a minute to finish my coffee as well.
Exactly. You guys, by the way, had a lot of registrations, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Means that it's top of mind.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think one of the reasons for this webinar is we had so many questions on the last one about data sharing that it came up throughout the chat, and then one of the ideas was, of course, well, if this is top of mind, why don't we just do a webinar on this specific topic?
Exactly. And for those people listening in, where can they find that one, by the way? Is it just on our website, or what's the easiest way to find the DAX 7 one that you guys did?
Good question. It's definitely on YouTube. Maybe Tiago can post a link to it, or one of our crew on in the audience.
That's not a bad idea. Yes.
If you
add the link to the DAX 7 one, because it's such a related topic, right? And you'll probably go into this later on, but it's good to add it here for those.
It should feature. I mean, the two are closely connected, but what's different about this one is that it's broad. I mean, it's on the topic of tax number validation rather than specifically data sharing in the European Union.
Yeah, and that's what I mentioned to you, Eiko, the other day as well, right? This is a topic that keeps coming back in various occasions. I was in Miami with a part of our team a few weeks ago for this Exchange Summit. It came up there a couple of times as well. It's just a very broad topic that is becoming more and more important across different use cases. So I can imagine that's one of the reasons why we're seeing so much interest in it.
I just shared the link where
to the past one
can check out. Yes, anyone can check out our previous webinar where we covered DAX 7 and specifically where we are so far.
Super.
Awesome.
Okay. If you guys are okay, I would suggest that we start in 1 minute. Give people 1 more minute for the real latecomers, and then we just kick it off. If people join a little bit late, that's not an issue. And otherwise, watch the recording.
I know that we can start a little bit later because normally I'd be explaining how to use the emoji buttons at the bottom as part of the admin, and now I know everybody is ready. So 1 more minute and we kick off.
There you go. Perfect.
And it's, by the way, nice to see some people returning from the data sharing webinar as well.
Yes. And by the way, maybe just as a pre-announcement, although I hope that you can do it again, people can always interact in chat, right? I'll be monitoring chat. Make sure that I float to you any questions that are there so that you can focus on the content. And let's make it as interactive as possible.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is, as for those of you who have been to the previous webinars, the first webinar that we organized, as well as any of the other fireside chats or the discussions we had online, you know that we prefer to have an interaction with the audience. We're not very stiff. We're more casual and conversational. So anything that you have top of mind, just throw it into the chat or directly to us. Cool. All right. Shall we kick it off? Maybe the first thing, Rob, you're on stage with us, which is different to what we did before.
Yes, but I'm not on the slide. Yes, you're right.
Not even...
So I do a very quick intro. Everyone, I'm Rob. I'm the Chief Tax Officer here at Fonoa. I'm here only for admin purposes to monitor the chat and make sure that any of your questions are going to be answered by Eiko and Attila today, so that they don't have to focus on monitoring the chat, but I will do that instead. But other than that, I play no role at all. I'm just here to enjoy, just like you. Go for it, guys.
I love the fact that Attila, we made our head of tax do the admin for us. There you go. Anybody wants to know how to get that done, we can connect on LinkedIn. So this is the second webinar in our series for Fonoa Tax Essentials. For those of you joining in just now, we were saying that the very first webinar that we did was to do with data sharing in the European Union, better known as DAX 7. A lot of the questions that we got through that specific webinar were to do with tax number validation. So we thought, why don't we just focus on this topic specifically? And that's exactly what we're going to do now. Very quick call out that the participants, some of you are returning, some of you are new. We have quite a varied audience, and in order to reflect that, what we'll do is we will address the topics which are, I think, hopefully relevant for all of you. We're not going to stick primarily to only tax use cases. We're going to try and look at from a product angle as well, maybe from a tech angle, but certainly definitely from a tax. First and foremost, we're going to do some admin introductions. Then we're going to focus on use cases. We're going to tell you, why do people even care about this space? And it's not just European Union EC sales list. We're going to go into some specific use cases that don't appear necessarily top of mind. Then we're going to look at some of the validation techniques that are currently being used in the market. And of course, feedback from last time was you love the resources, so we're going to continue with that tradition. We're going to give you what resources we have on our side that can help you make the decisions, build the tools that you're building in-house. Whatever you need is going to be a crossover here. The last piece of feedback that we received, we don't usually plug our products on these webinars. We haven't done that historically, and there's very good reasons for that. But a good number of you came back and said, can you please just show us? So what we will also do, apart from the three of us, we'll also invite one of our colleagues, one of our integration specialists, for 5-10 minutes at the very end to show us what it is that we mean when we're talking about building a product in this space, what it can look like. I'm going to show you what we have built in Fonoa Lookup. And without further ado, let's jump in straight into quick introductions on our side, and then over to the actual webinar. The folks, there's three of us on the screen. Rob did an introduction, of course, already, but both Attila and myself, for those of you who don't know, we work at Fonoa. I'm the head of tax technology within Fonoa, and Attila is the lead for our data sharing product. And of course, there is a big overlap between the data sharing side and the tax number validation. Hence, the two of us are going to be taking this discussion forward today. Both of us have got enough experience in looking at tax number validation, so hopefully we can share some of that with you today. First and foremost, use cases. These are the things you need to keep in mind. And why are we going to cover these off? There are time and time again that I wished that when trying to build these products in-house, I wish that I knew all the use cases. Quite often we get down the path of building something for our indirect tax colleagues when we realize actually there's applicable or similar use cases in other parts of the department. For example, corporate taxes, or certain things that we wish we knew, so we could have just planned them in from the very, very start. So most common use cases. Attila, shall I kick off with APAR and then you can go into the other ones? Or
please do.
All right. Accounts payable, accounts receivable, mainly used for VAT, right? Mainly used for VAT, but not always. Here we're talking about accounts payable. You want to double check that your vendors are charging you VAT correctly, that they're not just simply adding a tax number onto an invoice, collecting an additional average of 20% across the OECD. You're recovering that from the tax authorities, but in reality, nothing is being passed on. So one of the classical use cases to double check your vendors, very, very standard old use case. Pretty much most countries with a VAT regime or a GST regime will have this. Accounts receivable in classical, the most common use case here is for international businesses selling cross-border. Why do you want to validate a number? Well, typically you want to distinguish for your tax calculation purposes, whether it's a B2B or a B2C transaction. For those of you in indirect taxes, this is already second nature. For those of you who are not, when you sell cross-border and you are encountering a business, typically, but not always, you don't have to charge VAT. What you do is rely on something called the reverse charge. Many of the conditions, not always, but in many of the countries, the condition is that you need a VAT number a valid VAT number in order to be able to treat the transaction as B2B. That's not always the case, but in many countries, a growing number of countries, that is becoming the case right now.
Yes, so to give you the practical breakdown of that, at checkout, you want to make sure that you are dealing with a business or just a regular private individual.
Exactly.
And then, yeah.
And then e-invoicing reporting. So this is digital. This is called by so many different things, and we should probably do a webinar on this alone. But digital reporting, continuous transactional e-invoicing. Some people call it fiscalization. What we're talking about is submitting data to the tax authorities in a standard structured format, right? But when you're doing that, what's the use case here, Attila?
Yes, as you can see, or as you may have heard, there's countries that are introducing regulations and stricter regulations around the invoicing and reporting. And these oftentimes require you to submit a valid tax ID on your invoice or in your transaction report towards the tax authority. Some tax authorities, like the CFDI 4.0 coming up in Mexico, even go as far as they require you to submit a valid tax ID. But not only that, the name and the postcode or the zip code of the business or the individual has to also check out and match the tax ID, and you must consult the tax authority database. So yeah, as you can see, there's a pretty big e-invoicing use case here as well, on top of your AP and AR.
Can I add one piece of value straight away? In Mexico,
Please.
for those of you who are affected by this, one of the common things that I've seen happen in the past, why those transactions get recorded, not because you have the wrong data, the name, the tax ID, the RFC ID, and the postcode they match, but in the name, you may be including the legal entity type. So if you're having problems across over there, one of the first things to check is what are you pushing through in the name, even though you expect the data to be correct. If the legal entity is not is included, DCV, try removing that and then running the validations again. You might see a different result. So that's one of the very first common problems, specifically since you mentioned Mexico.
Correct.
Data sharing. We talked about this at length a
Absolutely.
few weeks ago.
So let's just recap. So very simply put, I'm sure many of you are already very familiar with the upcoming regulation of DAC 7. Some of your companies are not affected by it. Some of your companies are very much so affected, as we're all aware. But essentially, a cornerstone of the DAC 7 regulation is that digital platforms and marketplaces must validate the seller's tax ID numbers that they provided. They can either do this, and they are encouraged to do this in an automated manner through tax authority databases. But some tax authorities, as we've heard, go as far as requiring platforms to cross-check physical documents or ID cards, passports, etc. So that's an additional and brand new tax ID validation use case or requirement, if you will. And as we all know, these requirements are starting to show up around the globe outside of the EU. Canada is next. Australia, New Zealand are also on the agenda, with the US also severely extending its 1099 obligation, which is very similar and essentially just another data sharing obligation. And we can also hear from the EU, it's planning to release its DAC 8 regulation or implement its DAC 8 directive, which will be just essentially a extension of DAC 7 and moving into the crypto space. So any companies dealing with crypto payments will be affected by it, and tax ID validation in those cases will also be necessary. And another use case, which may sound pretty niche for you, especially if you're coming from an indirect tax function, but I'm sure you all heard the news about the global minimum tax going in effect from 2024. Those reports will also need to get compiled into a huge data file, compiling all your data from all your subsidiaries worldwide. This is obviously talking to multinational enterprises that are in scope of the global minimum tax regulations. So one of the very interesting use cases we've heard is that there is a need for companies to sort out their own entities and subsidiaries tax IDs and other details. And that can be a challenge when you have hundreds or if not thousands of entities worldwide, especially when you are required to compile all of that information into one essentially corporate income tax return. So tax ID validation and automated tax ID validation can give you a hand in that as well.
So let me just call this out straight away. So
yeah.
Unlike what normally when we speak to our colleagues and friends about tax number validation, the first instant reaction, it's VIES and European Union. What we're trying to say here is it's not VIES, it's not just the European Union, this is a global requirement. Quite often spanning multiple use cases beyond just VAT and GST. So bear that in mind. And the suggestion out of here is that you absolutely have to go and double check with your other counterparts. If you're looking to build something like this in-house, just do the due diligence, check with your colleagues about whether or not they have similar use cases. The mistakes that I've made in the past is to think that this is purely indirect tax, is purely VAT for one particular region, nothing else matters, only to discover halfway down the line we could have saved a lot of time and money had we just spoken to the folks who are sitting around us in different regions. Just a quick call out. Attila, withholding tax obligations, right? That's one more to cover. What do you mean by withholding tax? Interest, dividends, royalties, what's that?
Not that.
Not that. Okay.
At least not in this, not today, not in this webinar. So yeah, direct tax folks would be very familiar with withholding taxes. Also, people familiar with personal income taxation and personal taxes, but we're not really talking about that here. There's withholding tax obligation showing up across the globe, specifically from like a VAT realm, if you will, especially targeting digital marketplaces, digital platforms. They want to make sure that all of their sellers are compliant and declaring and charging the right amount of taxes. And one way of doing that is making sure that all your sellers, so think about gig and sharing economy platforms, ride sharing, food delivery services, just to mention very quickly the most typical use cases. Right, so you are dealing with thousands and thousands of sellers in these geographies, and one typical piece of requirement we see popping up, and just to give you two examples, India is one, and Mexico has a very similar thing. They do require digital platforms to validate the tax IDs of their sellers, just to make sure that they are registered for taxation in their country. This is true for VAT and income taxes as well. And if they cannot provide a valid VAT ID or tax ID, I should say, in that case, the marketplaces and platforms can be obligated to withhold some of the earnings or withhold some of the VAT charge.
Yeah, and I think here to call out is that what the tax number there does, it determines the rate at which you're supposed to withhold in some of those countries. So you may have to withhold in any case, but the amount that you have to actually withhold depends on perhaps the length of the characters, let's say Mexico, or the type of ID and the type of registration somebody has across over in India. Just two examples Attila brought out, but there are more.
Yes. In India, normally it's just a 1% withholding, but if you don't have a valid tax ID, it goes up to 5%, just to give you the specifics there. Okay, moving on.
All right, yep. Okay. And all right, tax ID validation techniques, what to keep in mind. Can we show them? Do you have one slide that has all of them on it, right?
Absolutely. There we go.
Yeah. So once again, sorry, folks, I'm lying to you. This is not all of the validation techniques. There's three more before this, but these are the important ones. There's we're going to get to these one by one, but before we even start on these, there's three more to mention. There's clearly the option of doing absolutely nothing. Okay, you don't have to validate anything at checkout, you don't have to validate anything on boarding, but in reality, what you're doing there is you're asking your tax team to take on a risk. What's that risk? Well, if you're not checking your vendors, you might be being charged VAT inappropriately, so risk of fraud or being defrauding. If you're not checking your vendors, customers' VAT IDs, then you're not entirely sure for cross-border transactions whether you're charging or not charging VAT correctly, unless your business models are so clear that you can get that information from somewhere else. That's the first thing, do nothing. The next one is close to doing nothing. You can ask people to tick a box to self-declare. I'm a business, I'm a consumer. The problem there is that, especially if you have tax exclusive pricing, when you tick that box, most people will realize the price is being changed. That incentivizes folks to start clicking those buttons. So again, it's not a perfect solution, and quite often you will see more B2B customers rather than what really is out there. So a kind of a tick box isn't great either, which is why we didn't put this up. The last one is a free field entry form. For any of you, you can express your horror in the emojis. If any of you have ever tried this, the kind of garbage that gets put into those free field entry forms is pretty bad. So pity your tax people, especially your VAT people, and don't do this to them. Put in at the very least as a format check. There's a lot of good sources out there. We have web pages on maybe we just go straight to format checks until on the next slide. Format checks. We have web pages which give you the formats in the majority of countries freely, and we will continue to populate these fields. They'll give you indirect tax IDs, and they'll give you the corporate tax IDs as well. In many cases, personal tax numbers. That's on our website. There are other sources you can ask your Big Four. Some of you will be working with tax engine providers. You can ask them, but you can get these lists relatively straightforward these days. If you're struggling, go to fonoa.com. They're there. Some check, next best thing, right? So not just checking the length of the characters of a number, but if you know the algorithm, which in some cases disclosed, you can put in to your system the ability to validate the number that's being entered. So we call it sum check. Some people call it checksum. Others call it algorithmic checks. So, but essentially what you're doing is you're computing the number, reverse engineering it, and making sure that actually the last digit or the first digit, whatever it is correct, and the number makes sense in accordance with how the government constructs these numbers. That's the second check. Caution: not everybody releases these. Database validation. This is now where it's getting interesting. Attila,
and let me stop you. Yes, let me stop you here. Yeah. And this is, I think, we need to make a clear distinction at this point. This is where we move into the online space from sort of like an offline use case. So everything we talked so far, format, sum check, and doing nothing, and all those things, you can do in-house or not do. But those are in your system.
On your systems, right? You can
hard code
third-party dependent. Okay.
Yes, and when we go into database validation, we mean online database validation, be it a tax authority website or another service provider. Then you're opening your doors and seeing what's out there and actually matching the information. This is when we get to the territory that can stand the scrutiny of tax authority audits and those hard-hitting questions. And I'll let you continue, Eiko.
Yep, what spot on. Database validations, this is when you're talking going to a local database, checking the number against the government and making sure that it actually is valid. That's really what we're talking about here. Does it exist? What's the difference between the other two? I think you made an excellent point, by the way, Attila. The difference for product managers, people building these types of systems, the very first, everything before this, the latency is pretty much real time, right? You can make those calculations in your systems in real time. Here you are a lot of the times dependent upon third party. In this case, the third party is a government database. The speed at which that database. Why is this important? If you're trying to build a solution for your checkout, you should double check. Speak to us. We can tell you what the latencies are across the globe, but they vary wildly. Typically, you can get down to below 3 seconds. But realistically, just double check with the latencies with various governments if you want to implement a VAT number or a tax ID check on onboarding, or even more importantly, during checkout. Fuzzy matching. Fuzzy matching, this is kind of going into a little bit more of the anti-fraud and validations. So here, fuzzy matching is something people may know it as Guth or Levenstein. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to match the ID to the name and the address that is on your records with those which are returned by the government systems. In many of these countries, and from the 100 plus that we currently covered, I think a large chunk of those will return to you the name and address when you're comparing VAT numbers. Some of them will do the same for corporate income tax numbers. Not many. Certainly, some of them will validate PII, kind of like personal tax IDs, but you need to provide that information up front. What we're saying with fuzzy matching is in let's say the VAT case, you can provide a number to a government database. They will return to you the name and the address, and the algorithm should check whether or not the probability of those addresses and names is the same. The probability, why? Because you sometimes get dots, dashes, different endings, abbreviations specifically for names. Instead of calling Alexander, call it Sasha or something along those lines. But the algorithms there can help you to determine whether or not the person who provided you the ID is the person to whom the ID actually belongs to. It's going into the area of anti-fraud. And I think lastly, going into a little bit into the real more advanced stuff is the silent alarms. If you really want kind of like a tier 1 product, which is preventing and protecting your company, yes, you need to consider all the other tools and tricks available and open to, which is looking not only at the name and address, but all the other available lists, which are, some are public, some are not, in relation to bad actors on the playing field. There are various different tips and tricks. I don't know, Attila, do we have any good examples that we can or should share at this point? But there are like some obvious ones.
You mean
I can give you one. I mean, yeah, no, I mean, look, there's various different, let's give you an easy one. There's various different lists from Colombia to Poland to other places where you can pull information, not necessarily from VAT, but incorporate in that system. So when you see certain tax IDs being used, you know that to flag those transactions as being a little bit higher risk than others. This is really pertaining to people who need to protect themselves against fraud. But if you really want to know more on this topic, we have specialists that you can have a conversation with.
I'll mention another one is the usual case. In many countries, the tax authorities issue a list of like bad taxpayers or taxpayers with significant tax shortages or taxes owed to the government. You might want to consult those lists as well in the background to make sure, since they're public, it's an easy implementation, right? Just to make sure that you're aware, at least, when you are about to make business with one of those actors.
Yeah.
All right, moving on.
Swiftly.
Okay, and this is where we wanted to give you just get everyone on the same page and remind ourselves what we are all talking about on a very practical level. So we're talking about people, tax analysts or business support specialists in the back office, going from vendor to vendor or client to client, checking their tax IDs, whether they provided the correct one in the given country, and does it have the right format. So I will just stop sharing for 1 second and show you one of the websites we all love. This is, for instance, the Vietnam Tax Authority's website to check for VAT numbers. So this is already translated to English, but let me show you, this is how it looks naturally. So a language barrier is just one thing, but as you can see, you need to figure out all these fields, get through this CAPTCHA, and then map all the results we have. Echo?
Yeah, I was going to say this CAPTCHA is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying is it's not really easy. If you can get an API connection to a government, it's great. That's really the way to go. You don't want to be doing this manually. The other point is that even when you do get an API, if you're doing more than the countries outside, if you're doing more than 5 or 6 countries, what you'll start to stumble into is the different formats of how they return the data and the type of data that they return to you. If you're struggling there is again, there's a good list of information about how you should be structuring this. I think you just need to speak to one of our engineers or somebody that has been working on this for a considerable amount of time. But one of the pain points I think a lot of people will experience when trying to do this is the variety of how people have built the system.
Right.
Resources, right? Where can you get this? And we're talking a lot very, very quickly. We want to get through this fast so that we can get to this page. There are a lot of things from our side. We've published extensively on this topic. My favorite, personally, I'm going to call it out, it is the Essential Guide to Tax Number Validation. I think that's slightly dark in color. It's kind of like 20, 30 pages worth of purely content on purely tax number validation. So if you're really interested in this topic and you want to fall asleep quickly at night, have a look at that. The others are really helpful resources, I think, that have inspired us as well to kind of build this product. So absolutely have a look at these resources. I think we can share these with you afterwards.
We will share it after you. Yes, this is also a question just coming through the chat. So we will share the entire slide deck with you after sometime after the webinar, and it will have the clickable links to all these sources. And we really appreciate you checking these out. We also included Zoom in there. This is just to remind you that there are great sources from like non-tax advisors, right? So Zoom, for instance, is a great example we love to refer to. They have such a great support site for their let's call them sellers, right? To help them and guide them through their local tax registration processes and get their basics right.
I think given the time, as David said, we have a couple of questions. We will ask our teams to get back to those on you. But just a quick recap before we depart. So the first thing that we said, this is an important space. It's growing in importance. There's a number of use cases, both within the European Union, but certainly outside. Those use cases are not restricted purely to indirect taxes or VAT. They are now spanning into corporate, personal, and other taxes, depending on the models that your businesses are operating. This is not going to go away, particularly with the onset of digital reporting and e-invoicing. As those numbers become more important, it's going to become more important to start validating. How can you do that? There are a number of techniques. There's a couple of risks that your company could take, do nothing. There's a couple of very basic things that you can do, format checks, sum checks, and then there's certainly more advanced things that you can go go ahead and try and implement, which are to connect to government databases, to implement fuzzy matching and certain types of silent alarms. What we did want to show you is that this is this is a direction that we went down. If you are looking into this space internally, if you're trying to build this, do reach out to us. We have a wealth of experience in this space, as you can see, and we're quite open to chat about these kind of topics and try and help you along your journey. Rob, anything else that you want to add before we wrap up?
No, I'm sweating here from typing so fast to try and answer all of the chat questions. Thanks everyone for the interaction here. These are really good and useful questions, by the way. As you could see, I couldn't answer them all in sufficient detail. I will try my absolute best to ask our team to follow up with all of you individually if anything is unclear, but also to just provide you with the demonstration of the questions that you had for specific countries. Thanks everyone, and a big thanks to Eiko, Attila, and David as well for sharing their insights on this.
Yeah, guys, thank you so much for engaging with us in the chat and the comments. Let us know what you think about these webinars to us directly or to the company. We do listen to your feedback, as you see. So please let us know what you think. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye everyone. Thanks for your time. Cheers.
Bye.